the topic, first of all, the topic of today's discussion is really interesting. We'll be looking at how to enter the US HealthTech market, and we have just the right panel for it. We want to be, as an accelerator, we want to be very specific about the things that we share with you. We want to give you a step-by-step guide and a kind of an exact, maybe a blueprint that you can use as founders to inform your strategy of entering the US market. Super excited about the panel, but before I jump into the wonderful panel, I'll introduce myself. My name is Tatiana. I'm Director of FemTech Lab Accelerator, and I will be moderating this panel today. And for those of you who are new to our community, maybe you haven't been to one of our webinars or one of our in-person events, I'll quickly share a few words about FemTech Lab. We are a global platform for innovators and disruptors in women's health space. Our goal is to innovate this amazing wave of products and innovations, and support the founders and help them go to market, fundraise, connect them with the right go-to-market channel partners in the UK and across the world, hence the webinar today. We run 2 cohorts a year in spring and autumn. We are currently in the middle of running our autumn 2023 cohort. We already have accelerated over 60 startups, so it's a fantastic community to be part of. And we have a strong network of over 200 mentors, and the amazing panel members today are part of our mentors, and we're super proud and always grateful for the time and effort that they share with our founders. We have leading industry experts, corporate partners. We have over 400 investors in our network. And we also last year launched an annual conference, Decoding the Future of Women conference, which is looking at the really kind of unpacking the future of women's health innovations. It's a really exciting event, so please join us. The next Decoding conference will be in June. Kate can share the details in the chat, so please go ahead and have a look. It's a fantastic conference. So with that, we are coming back, and I can see the chat is already on fire. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing about yourselves. Right, so we're coming back to the webinar, to the topic at hand, and to our amazing panel. So I'll pass on to you guys to introduce yourself. So Valentina, let's start with you. Would you like to introduce yourself and kind of maybe in reference to the topic today, where you are at with Daye?
Hi, everyone. I'm Valentina, the founder of Daye. We are a comprehensive gynecological health platform that started out in the UK, and we're now expanding to the US. We are active in 2 main spaces, vaginal health and menstrual health. And to that end, we have 2 main tampon products. The first one is a pain-relieving tampon, and the second one is a diagnostic tampon. We just introduced our products in the US market this summer after a lengthy FDA approvals process, which we've now completed. And Daye is now available in the UK and the US.
Congratulations, amazing.
Thank you so much.
It's a tough journey, so I would love to dive deeper into that and kind of hear from your experience what it was like. Thank you, Valentina. Candice, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. My name is Candice Nagaraja. I lead the women's health vertical at LEK Consulting. So in that role, we help companies, whether they're larger medtechs or diagnostic or provider groups or smaller startups and femtech solutions, understand their commercial strategy, their go-to-market strategy, and their M&A strategy. So I'll be talking with everyone today about some specifics around the US market and some different business models there. But overall, I'm really passionate in the femtech space and spend a lot of time in women's health. So really excited to be speaking with everyone today.
Brilliant. Super excited to have you today with us. Thank you, Candace. And Bethany? Oh, Bethany, you're on mute.
Hey everyone, thanks Tatiana. Bethany Corbin here, so excited to be here today. I am an attorney by background. I work with Women's Health Innovation Consulting. We work specifically with female founders who are looking to innovate and revolutionize women's healthcare, whether they're in the US or whether they're looking to come to the US market from abroad. So we work very closely with them, helping them navigate the US market, helping them understand reimbursement strategies, building their business model, building their entry strategy, market strategies, all of that, which is very exciting. And then I'm also the co-founder and CEO of FemInnovation, which will be launching in January and will be, I think, a fantastic resource for founders who are looking to enter the US market.
Thank you so much, Bethany. And please do share with us when you have when the platform is ready. It will be such a fantastic resource for our founders and all of the founders. Thank you. Right, so without further ado, let's jump straight into it. And guys, please add your questions. You can already start forming your questions. If you don't mind, please share them in the Q&A chat so I can see them and follow the structure. Right, so let's kind of kick off with a question, a billion question. When should a health tech startup consider expanding into the US market in terms of their product readiness and market fit? And Valentina, since you've already done it, done it very successfully with Daye in the US, I believe. Do you mind sharing your experience? Like, when did you know that it's time? And did you have any maybe unexpected hurdles or something that you weren't prepared for that came up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to when you should launch in the US is kind of as soon as possible, because it's one of the largest markets and a market that's very open to innovation and healthcare and private solutions. I think in the UK it can often be a bit more challenging because people are used to the NHS model and public healthcare. So there's so much space in the US for gynecological health innovation in particular, but for any forms of private healthcare in general. So my one regret is that we weren't able to introduce Daye in the US sooner, but we did have to undertake a fairly extensive FDA approvals process, which was delayed by COVID, rightfully so. The FDA was focused on the COVID pandemic and vaccination program. So it took us a little bit longer to introduce the products and services, but we're now ready to go.
Fantastic. This is the great experience. Thank you. Bethany, do you have anything to add? Like, what from your experience should startup think about before they expand?
Yeah, absolutely. I typically recommend startups start thinking about their market entry strategy and plan for coming to the US at least 6 to 8 months before they are actually ready to enter this market. And the reason for that is couple reasons, right? The first is the US has a lot of very different and diverse and fragmented rules when it comes to healthcare and how our industry is regulated, how it's governed. So oftentimes, depending on the type of company that you're trying to bring into the US, it may require a completely different structure than what you've implemented in Europe or Asia because of how we're set up. Additionally, your market entry strategy and your partnership strategy may not be the same as what you've currently developed because of our fraud and abuse laws. And so a lot of times companies come into the US and they think, great, we're going to partner with XYZ. We'll do some kickbacks. We'll do, a couple of different things. And we have to say no. Unfortunately, you can't do that because that's illegal in the United States. And that requires them to go back and then rethink their business model before they come back to the US. So typically, start thinking about it early. Anywhere from 6 to 8 months is when you should start involving legal and business strategists in this discussion. And then they can help you through whether it's an FDA approval process, whether it's building out a different corporate structure here, whether it's changing your partnership strategy. And they can really get that aligned for you so that whenever you come into the US, it's a very strategic move. And you're also able to come in and show product market fit much easier.
Thanks, Bethany. That's interesting. Candice, I saw you unmuted yourself. I was just about to kind of come to you with a follow-up question. So it's clear that, like, from compliance regulatory point of view, it's a different world, completely different beast from Europe, US. What about kind of different models? Are there any considerations for B2C or B2B or B2B2C startups? Kind of, are there any aspects that they need to consider as well?
Yeah, so there are quite a few. When you look at kind of the US healthcare landscape versus some of the European healthcare landscapes, we find that the US underperforms compared to European counterparts when you look at number of OBGYNs per 1,000 live births, when you look at number of IVF clinics per million women. So really the landscape is quite different here in the US. But to Valentina's point, it's much more privatized. So I think you have more kind of touch points that you can go to in the US. So I would say when you're thinking about how to really start and what business model to pursue in the US, we see many US startups starting as B2C before moving into a B2B2C model or even a B2B model. So I think B2C is definitely easiest to start with in the US, but then when you think about really how to drive access and adoption, it's really imperative to move towards some of those B2B2C or B2B models just to get wider adoption and broader access to your product. So when you think about some of the different segments of the market, you have the B2B business models. So those are for something like clinical products, something that's used by a clinician, and you would be targeting different provider networks here in the US. So really we have quite a few different segments of provider networks in the US. We have independent hospitals, we have hospital systems, whether that's on a local level, a regional level, or a national level, something like an IDN. We also have independent clinics, as well as then private equity owned clinics. And all of those different types of clinics have different needs and different purchasing behaviors. So really thinking critically about which clinics have, or which of the B2B customers have kind of the biggest alignment with your product and how they're purchasing, that's going to be really key. There's some other B2B models too. So something like a workflow solution, you'd be selling into the provider networks. Something like a benefits solution or a benefits aggregator, you would either be going to payers for a population health solution or to an employer network, for example. When you think about B2B2C models, this really works for products where you're having that kind of enterprise level sale, and then you're filtering it down to the consumers, really to drive access and adoption to your product. So again, this could be something towards provider networks, maybe an innovative network, something that's female focused or women's health focused, something like concierge medicine, where willingness to pay is a bit higher, especially here in the US. You can also target universities or education sectors, so larger organizations that will then filter your product down to their students or their patients. You can target employer groups, and you could also target payers. When you think about overall what some of those trends are in the B2B2C models in the US, a few things are really key when you're thinking about hitting those models. So healthcare economics and cost savings models, and really kind of proving the healthcare economics of your solution are really going to be key, especially for payers, somewhat for employers. We've seen that the employer channel really had a boom in the last few years going through COVID, as employers were trying to differentiate against each other with a variety of benefit solutions. But now it's a little bit more difficult to sell into that channel, and employers are really overwhelmed with a lot of the solutions that are coming into them. A second thing that you'll need, which I think touches really nicely on what Valentina said, is really your clinical evidence and backing for provider networks is going to be key to build those partnerships. So when you're selling into a provider network, or when you're offering a provider network with a partnership, you really want to prove that kind of clinical evidence of your solution, the improvement in the standard of care, and then also kind of how it is additive towards their revenue streams, which I think is a very different way of thinking in the US market versus some of the European markets.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. Valentina, did you find kind of a similar experience? Did you have to change or adapt your go-to-market model when you went to US?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with any new geography, but particularly one as specific as the US, you have to adapt your strategy in order to guarantee the success of your business with the local ecosystem and the local healthcare setup. So in the US, we're not launching direct to consumer alone, but launching with a diversified marketing strategy, whereby we'll have a workplace program, a clinic sales program, and a retail sales program at the same time. That allows us to reach customers from many different angles and many different points and better build brand awareness. We also had to conduct dedicated public health economics analyses in order to show the cost savings for the US healthcare setup versus the UK healthcare setup for our innovation.
So if you don't mind, I'll follow up quickly with all of those, because I think key question for many early stage founders, US is huge. How do you even start with all of those different channels and models? How do you build your network? How do you reach out to people? What works best? Maybe some good tips and insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is you need to identify your regulatory pathway. So how are you going to get your product approved? Then you need to speak with clinicians and CROs in order to confirm your clinical validation pathway. At the same time as you're doing your clinical validation, you can start thinking about your public health economics analysis, so you can create an intervention that's cost efficient and reduces healthcare costs. And then keep in mind that the B2B sales conversations in particular take an incredibly long time, whether they be for retail or clinics or insurers in the US as well. So it's great to start these as early as possible. Perhaps while you're still developing your product, you can start building those relationships, keeping a community of stakeholders within insurance spaces, within workplaces, within clinics, updated with your progress via a simple email newsletter. That could go a long way towards them then opening doors for you when you're actually ready to commercialize.
This is interesting. Thank you. I think before we jump in, my next question, I wanted to unpack a bit more on the regulatory side, because of course that's one of the biggest hurdles, and I would love to jump into that to you, Bethany. But before we do that, there's a question in the chat, so I'll address it straight away because it's kind of about what we're discussing about now. There's a startup that is a medical device startup, and the question is, how do they go about B2C? Candace, referring to what you mentioned about the kind of easier model within the US. If it's a medical device that needs prescription, how do they start with B2C in the US?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Perhaps I should have mentioned that when I did my overview. So if you are a medical device that requires a prescription, B2C is not kind of the best channel for you to start. You really need to be starting with the provider channels. If you are a medical device or a kind of medical tangential device that doesn't need a prescription, but you would still need to kind of get the FDA approvals, something like a new tampon design or something like a pelvic dilator design, where it's not regulated in terms of prescription, but it is regulated in terms of the device pathways that you need to go through. That could be something where you could go B2C. So obviously we see a lot of B2C models in those cases.
Yeah, perfect. So I see some more questions come in, so I'll address them straight away. But please add your questions in the Q&A chat. That way it kind of pops out to me. Right, so there's one first question. What is the biggest misalignment for UK startups wanting to target a US expansion, and how could this be overcome? And the second part of the same question is, where in the US would you say is the best place to set up a base?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here, Tatiana. You know, some of the biggest misalignments that I see whenever coming into the US is a desire to expand rapidly and target all 50 states at one point in time. That's a very common desire, right? Because obviously you can see a substantial return on investment the more states that you target. The problem with that, though, is it neglects the fact that we do have a very fragmented and two-tiered structure in the United States whenever we're thinking about healthcare laws. So we have, you know, at our federal level, right, we've got federal healthcare regulations, and then each state is also authorized to govern the practice of medicine within their borders. So a lot of times you have to deal with the fact that not only do you have to comply with federal requirements, but every single state may have its own unique requirements that you need to comply with. And developing a compliance strategy for all 50 states can be time consuming, it can be costly, and it can be burdensome depending on the type of compliance strategy that you adopt. So oftentimes what we recommend, and this kind of goes to the second question, is selecting 1 or 2 states in the US to start in and to come into and show that you have a good product market fit and product adoption, because that can really set the stage too for attracting US investors who can help you then expand to those other states. So that's really what we recommend, is pick 1 or 2 states, and which states you choose are ultimately going to be dependent on your goals and your business model. So for example, if you have a wearable, the states in which you choose to start in may be vastly different than if you're coming over with a telehealth company. And because with a telehealth company, we have corporate practice of medicine laws. And so that's going to prohibit and limit who can own that business entity in the US to a certified clinician, right? Licensed clinician. And so if you don't have one of those on your team who's also licensed in that jurisdiction, it can be very difficult, right? Then you have licensing fees, or you have to find somebody who's already licensed. So in that circumstance, what you would probably want to do is come over and test your model first in a state that doesn't have those CPOM laws. And that can help you show, yes, okay, we validated that this product is good. Now we're able to undertake a massive, 50-state expansion project. And that can be, very beneficial as well, to just show that you have that product market fit. So it's really going to depend. We see a lot of activity in New York City, right? Silicon Valley, California. That doesn't mean that those are the easiest states to get into. California is very attractive to a lot of individuals, but California has very strict privacy laws. So, depending on what privacy structure you're coming from, that can be a bit of a headache to have to deal with California's regulatory requirements. So it really is going to just depend on your business model and where you think you can get kind of the best reimbursement rates. That's also another thing. Reimbursement can vary depending on geographic location.
I would just add, Bethany, I totally agree. I was about to mention kind of New York and California as well, but just at a little bit higher level, in case there's this question from the group, if you look at the US landscape, you see a lot of the academic medical centers really kind of congregating in the Northeast. So that's New York and then the surrounding areas. We also have a pretty active research triangle in the Southeast. So think about North Carolina, South Carolina. So those are kind of 2 areas. If you're targeting academic medical center partnerships specifically, those may be 2 kind of good places to look to start.
Yeah, Candace, I think that's a brilliant addition. The only other thing that I did forget to add is we are, of course, in the US in a post-Roe versus Wade world, and that has also started to shift where companies want to come and establish their operations, because we do have some states that are very restrictive on the types of healthcare services that women can access. And so going into those states can be very difficult, and it can also not necessarily promote consumer adoption of your product, because women in those states are less likely to be using femtech products right now if they feel that their data could be exposed, right, or be a threat to them, from a civil or a criminal liability perspective. So I would take a look too when coming into the US and see which states maybe have more protective measures in place. Massachusetts, New York, California, there's a couple of states that have actually passed what they call abortion shield laws that are protecting the use and the disclosure of reproductive health data. So that could also be a place where you come in and you say, I want to show my commitment here. I want to get consumer adoption. So maybe I'm going to target one of those states that has more lenient reproductive health laws at this time.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Valentina, I wonder from your experience, how did you devise your strategy? Did you have to do that kind of research?
We just went around knocking on doors, speaking with clinics, speaking with academics, speaking with insurance companies, speaking with employers, identifying what the right level of evidence was for individual stakeholders, and then we amended our clinical protocols to account for that. We also continuously rely on post-market surveillance for ongoing data collection that helps us to provide some of the efficacy from real-world data and real-world interventions. So if we do ever have a gap in some of our clinical validation validation, we try and bridge it with data that we get from post-market surveillance. A quick practical note here, if you do want to collect post-market surveillance data, it's a good idea to be certified under ISO 13485. So it allows you to collect medical grade post-market surveillance data. And then if you want to publish some of your post-market surveillance data, you can, but make sure to get your questionnaires reviewed by an ethics committee approval. Post-market surveillance data can be a really powerful tool in getting stakeholders on your side.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I think we're slowly moving to the big question about the regulation in the US. What are the biggest hurdles that startups kind of come against when entering the US? And Bethany, I'll direct that question at you first.
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of different hurdles. They fall into several different buckets. The first is corporate structure. Oftentimes, whenever companies want to come into the United States, they'll either set up a new company or some type of a subsidiary from their existing company to do their operations in the United States, also to make themselves more attractive to US investors. And then, of course, as I was discussing earlier, right, if you're coming over with any type of telehealth model or type of model where clinicians are providing care, that requires a very specific structure in the United States if somebody is owning that company who is not a certified or licensed clinician in each of the jurisdictions where that company will be operating. You may have heard of it. It's called the MSOPC model, Management Services Organization, and then Professional Corporation model. So that can be very tricky to establish. It's got a lot of paperwork, a lot of different filings, and a lot of regulations that really govern the interaction between what clinicians can do versus what the Management Services Organization can do in that type of an instance. So if you're building telehealth companies, keep that in the back of your mind. That can be a 6 to 8 month process just to get that structure set up in the US if you're going into a corporate practice of medicine state. And so that's kind of bucket number one is corporations making sure that you're set up, registered with, have the appropriate business licenses for whatever you're doing in the United States. Of course, we have, FDA approval, our Food and Drug Administration, and, the different types of devices there that the FDA regulates. And, I know there's others on this call as well that have the experience going through that process. But a lot of times what we see is companies are trying to determine which side of the boundary they want to fall into with the FDA. A lot of times startup companies say we don't want to go through the hassle and the headache of FDA regulatory approval at this particular time. And so they say, we're going to fall on the side that is less diagnostic, right? Because once you have an algorithm, right, or machine learning component to your application or your product that is providing diagnoses, right, or providing medical advice, that pushes you over into that line of being software as a medical device, right? Then you have to go and get your product approved and looked at by the FDA. So a lot of times we see companies trying to skirt that line and not providing diagnostic services at their point of entry into the US until they've established product market fit, gotten some more US investment, and then maybe they add those capabilities later on and go through the FDA process. So that's one consideration that you'll want to think about. Sometimes we have companies, who come into the US and they already have those capabilities built in and they go through the FDA process. Again, that can be a lengthy process depending on which category for FDA approval or scrutiny that you fall into. The third category that we have is really privacy. So if you're coming over to the US from a GDPR, perspective on privacy, you're likely going to be in a much better situation than somebody who's coming over to the United States without a stringent privacy structure in place, because GDPR is much more stringent than a lot of the state and federal privacy laws that we currently have on the books. So that can be actually a value add for somebody coming over to the US from Europe. And I tell my clients all the time that if you are coming to the US from a GDPR framework, use that to your advantage, right? That is a selling point for you, because in our post-Roe world, in the United States, consumers are very concerned about their data privacy and how their data is going to be used and disclosed. You already have this framework in place that's not requiring you to undertake anything further, right? To just copy and paste that framework over in the US. Of course, you'll have to modify it slightly, to comply with state laws and HIPAA if that's applicable to you. But you have a stringent privacy framework, and consumers want to know about that. So use that to your advantage. Use that as a differentiator whenever you come into the US. If you're coming, and maybe you're not GDPR compliant yet, right? You don't have to be GDPR compliant. You come into the US, what you need to be thinking about is, again, we do have a two-tiered structure. So at the federal level, we have our Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, known as HIPAA. HIPAA is very limited in its applicability. So if you're just coming over with a general app or a wearable that's not being developed, right, or used, for clinical purposes, or with a covered entity, meaning like a healthcare provider, a healthcare plan, a healthcare clearinghouse, you're likely going to fall outside of HIPAA, at least for the time being. The majority of femtech apps, because more than 52% are software-based, the majority of them do fall outside of HIPAA right now. Doesn't mean that you don't have to comply with state laws. So we do have a handful of states that have enacted their own state privacy laws. California right now is the most stringent. And so you'll want to make sure that you are looking and complying with those privacy laws there. On the federal level as well, we do have our Federal Trade Commission, and that is also looking into data privacy from a health technology perspective. And that's where we're seeing really a lot of the action right now in the US for data privacy. A lot of that is concerning privacy policies, right? So those external statements that you have to your consumers that are saying, here's how we're going to use your data, here's how we're going to disclose it. We're seeing the FTC really scrutinizing how companies are using patient data and whether or not that complies with the promises that they're making to patients. We've started to see more and more cases coming out where the FTC is investigating or they're entering into settlement agreements. And so that's a very important part of operating in the US, is making sure that you have alignment there on your consumer promises with what you're actually providing. And then kind of, the other bucket that we have is fraud and abuse. So in the United States, we do have a lot of laws that prohibit what clinicians can or can't do when it comes to promoting products or when it comes to, making referrals to their patients. And so oftentimes we do have federal fraud and abuse laws. We've got the AKS, which is the anti-kickback statute. We have our Stark law, which is basically the physician self-referral limitations. And so if you're a clinician operating in this space, those laws are something you absolutely need to be aware of. You need to understand their limits and how they're operating, because they really do impact what products you can promote, right? Can you tell a patient to go and purchase a product that you then have a financial stake in, right? That's typically a structure that's not going to fly in the US unless you meet a specific exemption. So understanding that framework can be very complicated. And that's part of what makes the US so different and unique in what you can or can't do and the partnerships that you can or can't make. So keeping that at the forefront as you think about your strategy and, especially your growth strategy and who you're going to partner with, that can be really important. Again, those laws are limited applicability as well, so you'd have to see if they even apply. At the federal level, you have to be billing a federal payer, right? So Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, right? One of those types of entities for those to apply. But of course, we do have state AKS and Stark laws as well. Typically, that's going to apply for Medicaid, though some of them are broad enough to cover some commercial payer transactions. So making sure that you're clear on, your reimbursement strategy, because that's going to impact as well which of these laws apply when you come to the US. So I know that's a super high level overview. I could talk all day about that.
I would love to dive deeper into all of those. I wish we had time, but if guys, if you have any follow-up questions, if you want to learn more, please feel free to reach out to Bethany, and soon there will be a platform supporting on all of those elements. GDPR is a great advantage. It's great to know that we here in the UK and Europe are kind of already prepped well for that. I wanted to kind of, I have a specific question, and it's a question that came in from one of the startups on the accelerator, and it's very specific to FDA. So like, feel free to let me know if it's not relevant, but it's, so they've been told that it is mandatory to conduct a clinical study in the US with a USPI physician to get FDA approval. Is that so, or it's not a requirement? And maybe Valentina, you from your experience.
Yeah, it really depends on the specific product that you have. So, for example, if we look at the natural cycles, they are a digital contraceptive that got approved under the de novo pathway. So they're the first in their category. And even though it's a contraceptive product that's used for a very important purpose, which is to prevent unwanted pregnancies or to identify the exact fertility window for those who wish to conceive, they were able to get their product approved with post-market surveillance data rather than randomized controlled clinical trials. So it really depends on the product category and the class of the device that you're looking to approve. In general, because there's such a huge data gap in gynecological health, it's amazing if we can find funding to create more clinical trials, because that is the most robust form of evidence when it's placebo controlled and ideally published in an academic journal. But not every company has the resources to do so. Particularly in gynecological health, there's often conditions of extreme scarcity in which most of us are operating and building our businesses. So it's important to be realistic as well.
Yeah. Brilliant.
And just a quick note, the link that I posted in the chat for the FDA webinar, that applies to the de novos as well. So I think there was updated guidance or final guidance released in September. They're having this webinar in November, in case it's helpful for anyone to join that just to learn more.
Thank you. Please feel free. I'm just looking at the chat. If there are questions. Please add your questions in the Q&A chat. And we are moving on. So the kind of next step I wanted to look at, and Candice, you already mentioned, different go-to-market channel partners. So if we dive a bit deeper into this, how can international founders establish valuable partnership with US-based healthcare system or providers? Kind of how do they devise that strategy? How do they build those relationships and reach out to the right people? And again, Valentina also touched on it, but I would love to. I think it's such a key thing that's not easy done in a new country. Candice, do you mind?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, of course. I'm happy to start with just some overall thoughts. I think in terms of not first just hitting kind of the theoretical side, when you're thinking about how to establish valuable partnerships, it's really about matching your value proposition to what the specific partners or the KOLs that you're looking to partner with are really looking for. So I know I mentioned that kind of variety of provider segments earlier across kind of some of our standalone hospitals, our systems, our academic medical centers, office-based clinics, PE-owned clinics. When you're looking at each of those, they have a very different value proposition that they're kind of likely to hang on when you target them. So you really need to understand, for example, if you're targeting a private equity-owned clinic, they're very focused on growth and they're very focused on kind of reducing their costs. So when you're speaking to a private equity-owned clinic group, you need to really tailor your messaging to those points versus if you're talking to an AMC, for example, you really want to be focused on what's the clinical efficacy, what is the improvement in standard of care. Not that all of those factors aren't necessary when you're having conversations across these groups, but really hitting on the key ones and kind of bringing up the importance in the conversation versus bringing it back is really going to be important. I think on the tactical side of things, in my line of work, we speak to physicians quite a bit, obviously not from the point of view of a startup. So I would love to hear Valentina's take on this as well. But from my point of view, either through the consulting world or through some of my private projects and just personal projects that I've done in the space, physicians and KOLs are really willing to speak. So kind of that initial introduction is not too hard to get. It's really then transitioning that, using that initial introduction to your advantage to really show them what your product is about, really help them understand the value proposition, and then get them on board as a champion so that they can bring it into their organization and really champion it with their entire department or with purchasing. But Valentina, I'd love to hear kind of what you've seen in terms of tactical techniques to really get those champions on board?
With the risk of repeating myself, what has really worked for Daye is just kind of endlessly knocking on doors and not getting discouraged when we get a no, and reaching out to people on LinkedIn has been really effective for us. I know often you get told that you shouldn't just cold reach out to people on LinkedIn, that you should wait for a warm introduction. But if you can't get a warm introduction, if you ask for help or ask for feedback, generally most people tend to be pretty open, and you can piece the little different pieces of the puzzle together by asking questions on LinkedIn, reaching out to different experts, and then gradually building your network from there. When I started Daye 7 years ago, I had no network in healthcare or medical devices or manufacturing, and I did manage to build it up gradually. Again, we're just knocking on doors and not getting underwhelmed by the no's.
I think it's a key skill for a founder, whatever market you are in, to not be afraid of reaching out to people, reach out as many people as you can, ask for introductions. And I think if I may add from our side, joining an accelerator, be it FemTech Lab or any other one in the US, it's an instant access to the network. So it doesn't work for everybody, but it's a really fast way to get to the right people. So it's also a good way of doing it. There's a very specific question in the chat, and again, guys, feel free to add your questions. There's a question on the Hatchet Amendment, and Bethany, I don't know if you can speak to that. It prohibits a physician from selling anything that they prescribe, whether drugs or devices.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before with respect to what clinicians can or can't do in the United States. Whether it's a limitation from the FDA, right, or whether it's a limitation from the fraud and abuse perspective. There's so many different laws and diverse laws in the U.S. that really govern, durable medical equipment, devices, what clinicians can or can't do. The good news is, right, that's more limited to clinicians. And so, if you're coming over, a lot of femtech founders aren't clinicians. And so they don't really have to worry about that, or they don't have a clinician who's on their, founding team, right, or has a monetary stake in their company to trigger some of those laws, which can be very beneficial. But that's also something to think about too, whenever you're coming in and you're making partnerships in the United States with clinicians, because sometimes clinicians get really excited about a product, right, and they want to invest in it, right? That can then give them a monetary stake or a financial ownership interest in the company that may trigger one of these laws in the fraud and abuse category or the devices category that prohibits them from then referring patients to use those types of products. So that's really something to consider, whenever you're building out your go-to-market strategy as well, is, okay, if we, who are we looking for investors? Do we want to limit our investors so that we don't include clinicians, so that we're not potentially limiting our referral pipeline down the line as well? So that's kind of that broader fraud and abuse discussion as well tied in.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very comprehensive answer. So if we kind of twist it on its head and look at it differently, when is it not right for a startup to go into the US market? Because usually that's, and again, a lot of our startups come to us and this is where they want to go. Sometimes they don't even want to launch in there. And I actually wonder Valentina, what's your opinion on this as well as a founder? So some of our startups don't want to launch in their home country. They want to go straight into the US. So what would you advise on, in this case? Is it worth kind of launching in your home country, to test the product market fit and then go to US, or try to launch directly into the US, or not go into the US at all? When it's a very loaded question, but let's try.
I think it really depends on the funding that you have available to your organization. As launching in the US is a significant endeavor that requires a large team and resources for advertising. So it's easy to get lost in the noise of the US. So I think it's important to do that, to introduce your product in the US when we have the right level of funding.
Thank you.
Something else I'd add to that is when you look at what your solution is actually offering. So I know there's quite a few solutions right now that are really targeted towards helping employers with DEI initiatives, for example, and they seem to be quite successful in the European markets. When you look at the US market, just given that the US market is a bit less progressive than the European market on things like parental leave, on things like paid menstrual leave, that is going to be more of an uphill battle launching in the US. So not to say that you shouldn't launch in the US. I think it's a huge unmet need here, but I think just being cognizant that it's going to be a bit harder in terms of product market fit, and you may have to adjust some specifics for the US market. So that could be something else that you would take into account.
That's brilliant. So really doing your research, not only in terms of regulation and different laws, but also the market and the appetites of the providers.
Yeah, and I would chime in too, Tatiana, making sure that if you don't want to launch in your home country and you want to launch in the US, right, that you understand how that reimbursement strategy works in the US, because it's very different than how it might work in Europe or your home country. And so you may be building a model that you think is easily translatable to the US, right? But then you find out, oh, commercial insurance in the US aren't going to cover this. So then now my market strategy has to be simply a direct to consumer strategy because I can't get the reimbursement that I might have been able to get in my home market as well. So kind of thinking through whenever you're ready to come to the US, what that reimbursement opportunity looks like, and how you're going to navigate that. If you had a specific reimbursement strategy set up, that can be really helpful to think through as well.
Fantastic insight. Thank you. I see there's a question in the chat. Are US VCs backing European health startups at a similar rate to US startups? If not, then why do you think that might be? And what could change that? What a question. Great question.
I can offer some initial thoughts. I'm not a VC, so take this with a grain of salt. I assume, Rakesh, you mean European startups that are trying to enter the US market and get backed by US VCs. My hypothesis is that when US VCs are looking at a company, they're looking at kind of the ability of that company to grow. And they're not only looking at the business plan, but they're also looking at the founder and how familiar the founder is with the market space and with the regulatory space and how kind of equipped they are to take that company forward. So my hypothesis is that if there's kind of less enthusiasm in backing a European solution, it's probably partially a little bit of product market fit. And it's probably partially a little bit that the VCs need to be very confident that the founder and the founding team understands the US market and understands all the aspects that go into it. That would be my kind of baseline hypothesis.
Yeah, Candace, that's my hypothesis as well from what I've seen. Again, not a VC as well, but have interacted with them pretty extensively, especially in the last few months for FemInnovation. And really, what we've seen is coming over into the United States, unless you have or are contracted with somebody who is on the ground in the US, who is a core part of your team, who's leading that strategy, VCs tend to view that as a risk area, right? It's not to say that they're not going to invest in you because of that risk, but they view that as a riskier proposition because they realize that you may not be familiar with all the intricacies of the healthcare systems here. And if you're not, right, there's more of a potential for you to accidentally enter into a partnership or a contract that might be illegal, and that could then expose them to risk. So I think also having somebody who is on the ground in the US, who's familiar with the US operations as you're expanding, that can be a big benefit to try and mitigate that risk and say, no, what, we've hired somebody who's familiar with this area and they're on the ground, they're leading our US expansion, and that can add some confidence for VCs.
And could that be like a hire or maybe a mentor or advisor in early stage?
Yeah, if you're coming over to the US and you're looking for a VC, it's usually got to be more than just a mentor, somebody who's actually integrated into the company, who's very familiar with the company's operations, who's kind of keeping an eye or developing the strategy for product expansion, just because of how different it is state by state. And sometimes, one of the things that I've seen as well, just even as a consumer, is a lot of people list individuals on their advisory board, right, or their mentor board, but it's very difficult for VCs and others to really understand how much involvement does that person have? Is that person on, a regular call, or is this somebody that you met once and you've talked to them maybe twice a year? So that can also, I don't think that there's a ton of stock placed just in kind of the advisor and the mentorship role when you're coming over to the US looking for money.
That's a brilliant advice. Thank you. Valentina, you've raised from both US VCs and UK VCs or European VCs. What's in your experience, what's the difference? How was it for you?
So most US investors will heavily discount any traction that you have in Europe, and that's another reason why it's important to diversify your geographical positioning. I think it's generally harder to raise for a US-based business for a EU-based business from US investors. That's the feedback that I have heard time and time again, that they want US-based traction, and in general, a few of them have mandates to not invest in companies that are only focused on Europe or only have traction in Europe.
And just in general, raising in the UK, and then you went into the US market, you've launched and you raised in the US for US expansion. How, in your experience, was there any difference in kind of mentality or how you pitch or the questions you get? You already mentioned that they discount the traction that you have. Are there any other things, what really moves that dial for them to make them believe in you?
I think it's very similar in terms of what makes them believe in you, what European and US investors look for. It's the same things and the same broad benchmarks for seed, Series A and Series B. It's the same kind of conviction that the founder has in the business, the same levels of growth. So I don't think they have different expectations, but just US-focused firms prefer to invest in US companies, and European firms prefer to invest in European companies.
That's true. Thank you. So
just quickly, I actually need to run. I need to excuse myself from the panel, but thank you so much for having me, and I hope you have a great rest of the conversation.
Valentina, thank you so much. It was a treat to have you on the panel. Thank you.
Speak soon. Bye.
Thank you. Let me see. If you have any questions for Valentina specifically, feel free to share in the chat and I will send it to her. Let me see if I haven't. Candice, I can see you already replying to
Gerald speak for service point, and that's a great point. And I just wanted to make the point that it is not just about the reimbursement. Often organizations want to make a margin on specific solutions. So for example, if there's different therapeutics that they're using, they would like to be reimbursed more than the price of the therapeutic is to procure, so that they can essentially make money on using that device, which I think is a very different dynamic in the US versus in the European geographies.
Thank you very much. There's a question on the another question just came in. We only have 4 minutes, so I'm conscious of the time, but could you please speak more on how to deal with apps and data privacy? There's always a risk that it will be downloaded worldwide.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. There's a couple of issues with data privacy, right? It's obviously each country, in the US, each state has its own privacy restrictions and privacy requirements. So what you need to be careful of is making sure that you're not directly targeting your application to users in a country where you haven't launched in that country yet, right? Or you're not compliant with their privacy policies. And so a lot of times you can get around this by making it clear on your website and on your app that this is only for users in XYZ jurisdictions at this time. time, you might be expanding further, but at this time it's limited to users in the United States or users in Europe and the United States. That can help to show that you're not specifically targeting maybe users in Canada, right, or users in Japan. So that's kind of one way to do it. The other thing that and I do not recommend this, right? But some founders, launch their app and they just kind of leave it out there for anybody to download worldwide. That is risky if you're not in compliance with the relevant laws and if you're not set up in those jurisdictions from a licensing standpoint, right, or from a doing business standpoint, depending on taxes. So there's a couple of other, key considerations there that make it riskier to just kind of leave your app out there as a free for all and say, oh, I didn't know somebody was downloading it over in, Singapore. So making it very clear who you're targeting, limiting, there could be ways to limit who can access websites. And so making sure that you are limiting the application's reach, right, for those data privacy concerns. That's really essential just to minimize your risk. And also, as you continue to expand into other jurisdictions, right, making sure that you're compliant with those requirements, making sure that you've updated your privacy policy and notices before you launch in those jurisdictions. And then not simply saying, great, I had a privacy policy, I've done my notices that I need to, and I never need to look at them again. That's something that we see a lot of startups getting in trouble with, especially in the US, is they don't view their privacy notices and policies as living, breathing documents that need to be updated every time you add a new feature or you go into a different geography.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Bethany. Right, so we have 1 minute. So maybe quickly, if there was one piece of advice you would share with a startup that wants to enter the US market, what would it be?
So this is a hard question, but I would say to the extent that you can make your solution and you can prove that your solution is improving on clinical standards of care. So whether that's having a clinical co-founder on your team, or a very specific clinical mentor, I think that that's super, super key. And then it's pursuing partnerships with either different medical centers or with key physician KOLs to really get that data in whatever form so that you can really prove those findings. I think that's absolutely key. And that's what I don't see for a lot of startups today for a variety of reasons that we've talked about. But I think that would really help drive success.
Fantastic, Candace.
Yeah, Candace. That's brilliant. And I would echo that because there have been studies showing that a lot of femtech devices on the market today are not meeting clinical accuracy thresholds. And so providers are not recommending them to patients because they don't know how they're validated and they feel data overload. And so the data is not being incorporated into the clinical standard of care. So I think that's brilliant, Candace. And then my only addition would be, don't forget about leveraging patient advocacy groups and patient groups. I think that's oftentimes forgotten by startups, and not only incorporating the patient voice into the product development phase, but also using patient advocacy groups as a key marketing area because they're going to want to promote products that are going to be helpful to their members. And so that can be a way in which you can already establish product market fit very early on by working with those groups.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I feel like we've really touched on so many different key points to consider. So we have shared a lot of really insightful tips. So thank you very much for this. If you still have any questions that we haven't answered, I know there's a couple that we didn't have time to address. Feel free to email them to me, and we might do a follow-up webinar just to go deeper on this. But Candace, Bethany, it's such a pleasure to have you on the panel today. Thank you very much. We will share a recording of this webinar with everybody. And please, if you would like to stay with us further, we will open applications for the spring 2023 cohort. This will open in December. So if you go to femtechlab.com, you can sign up to be alerted when we open applications. You will get access to these fantastic mentors and many more. And also sign up to our next webinar. I believe Kate just shared it in the or about to share it in the chat. Next, we will unpack fundraising, and this webinar will be on the 12th of December. But if you go to femtechlab.com events page, you will see all of our events, in-person webinars, and application announcements. With that, I will let you go. Thank you very much once again. And everybody who joined us today, thank you for your time. Brilliant. Thank you.